The auctioneer slapped his clipboard against his leg and looked into the shadowy barn. "Nothing much left in here," he announced. "A few broken shelves, some dust, and old seed boxes nobody wants." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Buyers shifted their boots across the packed dirt floor. Some were already looking past the barn toward the fields they hoped to own before sunset. Others barely glanced at the weathered wooden boxes stacked against the far wall. Only Clara Whitcomb didn't move. She stood beside the boxes with both hands resting on the faded wood, her face pale but steady. Then one of the buyers, a gray-haired agricultural consultant from Wichita, stepped closer. His eyes locked onto a barely visible marking burned into the side of a box. RF 42. The smile disappeared from his face. A second later, the barn fell silent. Even the auctioneer stopped talking. Because suddenly, the most valuable thing on Harper Bend Farm wasn't the land. It was what everyone had just laughed at. If you're listening from a small town, a back road, a farm lane, or anywhere that still remembers the value of things most people overlook, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Stories like this travel farther than any highway. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family farms, and the quiet wisdom that refuses to disappear, consider subscribing before we return to the day Harper Bend Farm stood on the edge of being lost. 3 months before the auction, spring arrived slowly in Mason Creek, Kansas. The winter had left behind hard ground, rust-colored fields, and more bills than most farmers cared to count. The cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to show green, and the wind still carried enough chill to remind people that another cold front could arrive without warning. Harper Bend Farm sat a few miles outside town at the end of a gravel road that curved around an old drainage ditch and disappeared behind a stand of aging oak trees. The farm wasn't large by modern standards. It wasn't rich, and it certainly wasn't fashionable. The paint on the barn had faded years ago. Several fence posts leaned at angles that would have irritated any professional surveyor. One machinery shed carried a roof patch held together by determination more than craftsmanship. But to Clara Whitcomb, the place was home. She was 52 years old, with weathered hands, tired eyes, and a habit of thinking before speaking. Most mornings began before sunrise. She fed the chickens, checked the fences, and walked the fields long before the rest of Mason Creek started its day. The land had belonged to her family for nearly 90 years. Her grandfather had broken the first ground with horses. Her father, Samuel Whitcomb, had survived droughts, floods, and market crashes that should have buried the farm decades earlier. Now the responsibility belonged to Clara, and some days it felt heavier than she could carry. The previous 3 seasons had been difficult. Fuel prices climbed. Equipment repairs multiplied. A hailstorm had destroyed part of a crop that was supposed to help pay down debt. Each setback seemed small on its own. Together, they formed a chain that tightened around the farm month after month. Yet the thing Clara worried about most wasn't the debt. It was the barn. Most people saw an old building filled with outdated tools and forgotten supplies. Clara saw the last place where her father's presence still felt real. Samuel had spent countless evenings there, sorting seed, repairing equipment, and filling notebooks with observations about weather, soil conditions, rainfall patterns, and crop performance. Many of those notebooks remained exactly where he had left them. So did dozens of wooden seed boxes stacked carefully against the north wall. Visitors rarely noticed them. Even Clara's nephew Ben, who occasionally helped around the farm, assumed they were empty storage crates. But Samuel had never been the type of man who kept useless things. Sometimes Clara wondered whether she was protecting something important or simply refusing to let go of the past. The uncertainty haunted her more than she admitted. One windy afternoon, she stood inside the barn watching dust drift through shafts of sunlight. Her eyes settled on a faded marking burned into one of the boxes. RF 42. The letters meant something. She was certain of it. Her father had once spent an entire evening explaining those markings, but the memory remained frustratingly out of reach. Outside, tires crunched across the gravel driveway. A delivery truck from First Prairie Bank rolled to a stop. The driver stepped out carrying a large certified envelope. And before Clara even saw the logo printed in the corner, a familiar feeling settled into her stomach. The kind that arrives when bad news has finally found its address. The certified envelope sat unopened on Clara Whitcomb's kitchen table for nearly an hour. She already knew what was inside. Farmers learned to recognize certain kinds of mail long before they read them. The heavier the envelope, the worse the news usually was. Outside the window, the field stretched toward the horizon beneath a pale Kansas sky. A few rows from last season remained visible, stubborn reminders of a harvest that had never produced enough. Finally, Clara broke the seal. The letter confirmed exactly what she feared, unless a substantial payment was made within 30 days. First Prairie Bank would begin foreclosure proceedings and schedule a public auction of Harper Bend Farm. For several minutes, she simply stared at the paper. Not because the notice surprised her, because seeing the words in black ink made the danger real. The next morning, she drove into Mason Creek. First Prairie Bank occupied a red brick building near the courthouse square. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. Clara had walked through those doors dozens of times over the years. Today felt different. Daniel Rusk met her in a small office overlooking Main Street. He was in his early 40s, dressed neatly, with the tired expression of someone who spent most of his day delivering news nobody wanted to hear. A file nearly 2 inches thick rested on his desk. Clara recognized her family's name on the tab. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. She sat down slowly. "I didn't have much choice." Daniel nodded. Neither of them smiled. For several minutes they reviewed numbers Clara already knew by heart. Equipment loans, operating expenses, interest payments, 3 difficult seasons, unexpected repair costs. The figures piled up like fence posts after a tornado, each one manageable alone. Together, impossible. "There has to be another option," Clara said quietly. Daniel folded his hands. "If there were, I'd show it to you." She reached into her bag and removed one of Samuel Whitcomb's notebooks. The cover was worn soft from decades of use. "My father tracked weather patterns for 40 years, she said. He developed seed lines that survived droughts most farms couldn't handle. This land still has value." Daniel glanced at the notebook. Then he looked back at the financial reports. "Clara, I'm not questioning your father's experience, but the bank can't lend against memories." The words weren't cruel. That almost made them worse. Across the room, a young employee named Megan Pike organized paperwork at a nearby desk. She couldn't help overhearing. Her eyes drifted toward the notebook. Unlike Daniel, she seemed curious, especially when she noticed faded handwritten labels sticking from several pages. One tab read, "South Ditch Records." Another read, "R 42. Megan frowned slightly but said nothing. Daniel continued, "The board already extended your repayment schedule twice." "I know. They won't approve another extension." Silence settled between them. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past the window. Someone waved to Clara. She barely noticed. "What happens now?" she finally asked. Daniel slid another document across the desk. The auction date. 4 weeks away. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Public sale? Clara asked. He nodded. Unless the debt is satisfied before then. For a long moment, neither spoke. Daniel wasn't celebrating. In fact, he looked uncomfortable. Harper Bend Farm had existed longer than the bank itself. Everyone in Mason Creek knew that, but numbers didn't care about history. Before Clara stood to leave, Daniel hesitated. There is something else. Her stomach tightened. What? He opened another file. A buyer has already expressed interest. A buyer. Someone willing to purchase the entire property. The words landed harder than the foreclosure notice, because suddenly the threat wasn't abstract. Someone was already imagining life on her land. Who? Clara asked. Daniel looked down at the paperwork. Nolan Vance. The name was familiar. Very familiar. And not for a reason that brought comfort. Because Nolan Vance wasn't a farmer. He was the man buying farms all across western Kansas. And according to the rumors spreading through Mason Creek, Harper Bend Farm was next on his list. Mason Creek was the kind of town where news traveled faster than the wind. By the time Clara Whitcomb stopped at Calhoun Feed and Grain the next morning, half the county already seemed to know about the foreclosure notice. Some people avoided mentioning it. Others tried too hard to sound sympathetic. Neither made the situation easier. The feed store sat beside the railroad tracks, its wooden porch worn smooth by decades of boots. Farmers gathered there almost every morning, drinking coffee and discussing weather forecasts they trusted more than most television meteorologists. As Clara stepped inside, conversation softened for a moment. Not completely. Just enough. That was somehow worse. Lila Calhoun stood behind the counter filling seed orders. She offered Clara a warm smile. Morning? Morning. Lila hesitated. You holding up? Clara shrugged. Depends on the hour. That earned a small laugh. For a few seconds, things felt normal. Then a black pickup truck pulled into the gravel parking lot. Several men outside glanced toward the window. One of them muttered a name. Nolan Vance. The truck door opened. A tall man in an expensive work jacket stepped out. He looked more like a corporate executive than a farmer. Clean boots, pressed jeans, confident posture. Nolan Vance had built a reputation across western Kansas by purchasing struggling farms and converting them into highly automated agricultural operations. Some people admired him. Others viewed him as a symbol of everything changing too quickly. Most agreed on one thing. He was successful. Very successful. Nolan entered the store carrying a rolled set of plans beneath one arm. The room quieted. Not because people disliked him. Because whenever Nolan arrived, important things usually followed. His eyes found Clara almost immediately. Mrs. Whitcomb. Mr. Vance. He offered his hand. She shook it politely. Nothing more. I've been hoping we'd have a chance to talk. Clara already knew where the conversation was headed. About my farm. Nolan nodded. I'd prefer to discuss opportunities before circumstances force decisions. A few customers pretended not to listen. None of them succeeded. Nolan unrolled the plans across a nearby table. Detailed drawings covered the paper. New irrigation systems, climate-controlled storage facilities, research plots, automated monitoring stations. The project looked impressive. Even Clara had to admit that. This is what we're building, Nolan explained. A regional demonstration farm. Several farmers leaned closer. The plans represented investment, jobs, new equipment, Economic activity, things Mason Creek desperately needed. Nolan pointed toward a section on the map. Harper Bend sits directly between two properties we've already acquired. Clara studied the drawings. Her family's land appeared as a blank space in the middle, like a missing puzzle piece. "You've planned this already," she said. "We've explored possibilities." The answer was careful. Too careful. Nearby. Roy Bell stepped forward. Roy farmed several hundred acres west of town and never struggled to share his opinions. "You know," Roy said, "if somebody offered me what Nolan's paying, I'd sign before lunch." Several people chuckled. Clara didn't. Roy immediately regretted the comment. His expression softened. "Sorry. Didn't mean it that way." "It's fine." But it wasn't. Because everyone knew the truth behind his words. Harper Bend Farm wasn't viewed as valuable anymore. Not compared to modern operations. Not compared to the future. Nolan folded his plans. "I respect what your family built here." Clara believed he meant it. That was what made him difficult to hate. He wasn't greedy in the cartoon villain sense. He genuinely believed modernization would help the region. "I hope we can find common ground," he said. Outside, the wind rattled a loose sign above the porch. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Roy scratched his chin. "Your father used to grow some strange corn out there." Clara looked up. "What?" Roy pointed vaguely toward the countryside. "Back during that drought years ago. My dad grew a lot of things. Not like that." Roy frowned as he searched his memory. Red kernels. Nobody planted it anymore. Folks thought he was crazy until his field stayed green longer than everybody else's. Something stirred in Clara's mind. A memory she couldn't quite reach. Before she could ask more, Nolan glanced toward her. "Speaking of old things," he said casually, "I heard your barn still has quite a collection." Clara's expression hardened. "What about it?" Nolan smiled. "Some antique equipment. Storage boxes. Historical pieces." His tone remained friendly. Too friendly. "If the auction happens, I'd actually be interested in purchasing some of those items separately." "Why decoration?" He laughed lightly. "Agricultural history sells surprisingly well." Clara didn't answer, because suddenly she wasn't thinking about the land. She was thinking about the seed boxes. And for the first time, she wondered whether someone else might know more about them than she did. That evening, long after the lights of Mason Creek had faded into the distance, Clara Whitcomb stood alone inside the barn. The building smelled of old wood, machine oil, and dry earth. It was a familiar scent, the scent of her childhood. Wind whispered through narrow gaps in the siding, stirring dust that drifted through the last rays of sunset. Shadows stretched across the floor, wrapping themselves around forgotten tools and weathered shelves. At the far wall stood the seed boxes. Dozens of them. Some were neatly stacked. Others sat exactly where Samuel Whitcomb had left them years ago. Clara pulled one closer and brushed away a layer of dust. RF 42. The marking looked even older under the lantern light. She traced the letters with her fingertips. "What were you trying to tell me?" "Dad," she whispered. No answer came. Only silence. The same silence that had followed Samuel's death 6 years earlier. A silence Clara had never quite learned to live with. She lifted the lid. Inside were paper packets, each carefully labeled in her father's handwriting. Dates, weather notes, field locations, rainfall totals, planting observations. Most people would have seen clutter. Samuel had seen records. Clara sat on an overturned bucket and began sorting through them. As she worked, memories returned. Her father walking field rows before sunrise. Her father kneeling in the dirt, crumbling soil between his fingers. Her father insisting that every season taught something if a person paid attention long enough. Back then, Clara hadn't always listened. When she was 22, she left Harper Bend Farm for Wichita. She studied accounting, found an office job, built a life far from tractors and drought reports. For several years, she rarely returned home. At the time, she believed she was escaping uncertainty. Only later did she realize she had been escaping responsibility. Then Samuel became ill. The farm needed help. And Clara came back. By then, debts had already begun accumulating. Equipment was aging. Crop prices were falling. She had spent the last decade trying to catch up. Some nights she wondered whether she had returned too late, whether she had already failed the farm before she ever took control of it. The thought still haunted her. A sudden noise broke the silence. "Still working." Clara turned. Her nephew Ben stood in the doorway holding a flashlight. At 14, Ben spent most weekends helping around the property. He wasn't officially family anymore through marriage, but Samuel had always treated him like a grandson. "Couldn't sleep?" Clara asked. Ben shrugged. "Couldn't stop thinking about the auction." Neither could she. The boy wandered deeper into the barn, shining the flashlight across the walls. His beam paused near a faded map hanging behind an old workbench. "What's this?" Clara looked over. The map had been there for years. She honestly hadn't paid attention to it recently. Ben pulled it loose from the wall. Dust scattered across the floor. The paper crackled as he carefully unfolded it. It showed Harper Bend Farm decades earlier. Field boundaries, drainage routes, fence lines, handwritten notes. One marking immediately caught Clara's eye. South Ditch. The same words she had seen inside Samuel's notebook. "That's strange," Ben said. "What?" He pointed toward the map. "The ditch isn't where the county map shows it now." Clara moved closer. He was right. The route was different, significantly different. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Ben smiled. Maybe Grandpa changed it. Maybe. But Samuel rarely changed anything without a reason. The thought settled heavily in her mind. Hours later, after Ben went home, Clara filled several small trays with soil and carefully planted samples from different seed packets, including one marked RF42. She placed them near a window in the farmhouse kitchen. Then she waited. The next morning she checked them. Nothing. The following day she checked again. Still nothing. 3 days later, the soil remained bare. No green shoots, no signs of life, just damp earth. Clara stared at the trays for a long time. The auction was approaching. The debt remained, and now even the seeds seemed determined to stay buried in the past. But as she turned away, something caught her attention. A note tucked inside one of Samuel's notebooks. Only 5 words, written in faded blue ink. "When the seeds fail, follow the water." Clara read the sentence twice. Then a cold feeling moved through her chest, because suddenly she wasn't sure the seeds had ever been the real secret. The words stayed with Clara Whitcomb all night. When the seeds fail, follow the water. Samuel Whitcomb had never written anything without purpose. He was the kind of man who measured every word the same way he measured rainfall carefully, and only when it mattered. The next morning, Clara carried the notebook into town. If the seeds weren't growing, perhaps someone else could tell her whether they were worth anything at all. The Miller County Agricultural Extension Office occupied a small building behind the courthouse. The walls were lined with crop reports, soil maps, and photographs of record harvests from years past. Dr. Leah Mercer greeted Clara with a professional smile. Leah had spent years studying crop genetics and drought-resistant farming methods. She was respected throughout the region, especially by younger farmers eager to modernize their operations. After introductions, Clara placed several seed packets and Samuel's notebook on the desk. Leah adjusted her glasses. "What exactly are we looking at?" "I was hoping you could tell me." For nearly an hour, they examined the contents. Leah flipped through weather records, field notes, yield estimates, planting observations. The notebook was remarkably detailed. In some places, Samuel had recorded rainfall measurements down to fractions of an inch. He was thorough, Leah admitted. He always was. Leah carefully opened one packet marked RF-42. A few deep red kernels rolled into her palm. She studied them under a magnifying lens. Interesting, but not enough. "I'll be honest," she said. Clara braced herself. "Most seed stored this long loses viability." The words landed heavily. Leah wasn't being dismissive. She was being scientific. That somehow hurt more. "Even if the seeds are unique," Clara asked. "Unique doesn't always mean useful." The room grew quiet. Leah continued. "There may be historical value, maybe research value, but commercial value is another question." Clara nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer she wanted. Outside, clouds gathered over Mason Creek. The afternoon felt darker than it should have. After leaving the extension office, Clara stopped at Annie's Diner on Main Street. She wasn't hungry. She simply needed somewhere to sit. The diner buzzed with conversation. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Waitresses moved between tables carrying plates of meatloaf and pie. For a few minutes, Clara sat unnoticed. Then she heard her name. Not directly, just close enough. A table behind her. Several local farmers. Roy Bell among them. "She's still chasing that old seed story," someone said. A chuckle followed. Roy sighed. "She's trying to save the farm, with museum corn." More laughter. Not cruel laughter. The kind people use when they think something is hopeless. Which sometimes feels worse. Clara stared into her coffee. She couldn't even be angry. Part of her feared they might be right. The farm was weeks away from auction. The seeds hadn't sprouted. The bank wasn't changing its position. And now even the experts seemed uncertain. For the first time since receiving the foreclosure notice, she seriously considered giving up. Not because she wanted to, because she was tired. Tired of losing. Tired of defending things nobody else valued. Tired of wondering whether she had misunderstood her father's legacy. By the time she returned home, rain had begun falling. A steady spring rain. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to darken the soil and turn the gravel road slick. That evening, Clara walked toward the barn. The rain drummed softly against the metal roof. Inside, water seeped through familiar places along the walls. She had seen it hundreds of times before, yet something suddenly caught her eye. A dark stain running across one section of the barn interior. A watermark. Old. Very old. She raised her lantern. The stain formed a line nearly 4 feet above the floor, directly beside a note Samuel had written years ago on a support beam. The handwriting was faded, but still visible. "South Ditch takes the first anger of the creek." Clara froze. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, she opened the notebook. Several pages described flood seasons, water levels, drainage routes, emergency channels. And then she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. The water levels in the notebook matched the stain on the wall almost exactly. Not approximately. Exactly. Samuel hadn't been recording memories. He had been recording measurements. Outside. Thunder rolled in the distance. Inside the barn. Clara turned another page. Then another. And suddenly she realized something unsettling. The notes about RF-42 appeared again and again beside references to the south ditch, as if the seeds and the water system were connected somehow. But before she could understand how, lightning flashed beyond the barn doors. And in that brief burst of light, she noticed something she had never seen before. A section of wall behind an old shelf had been built differently from the rest, almost as if someone had hidden something there years ago. The storm moved east before midnight. By sunrise, Harper Bend Farm stood beneath clear skies washed clean by rain. But Clara Whitcomb wasn't thinking about the weather. She was thinking about the section of wall hidden behind the old shelf. The moment daylight reached the barn, she returned with a hammer, a pry bar, and more curiosity than she had felt in weeks. The shelf itself had not been moved in years. Dust covered every board. Spiderwebs stretched between forgotten tools. Whoever built the wall clearly never intended anyone to look behind it. After 20 minutes of work, Clara finally pulled the shelf aside. A narrow cavity appeared. Inside sat a small metal box. Nothing more. Nothing less. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. The box was old enough to belong to Samuel, old enough to matter. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it free. The lid resisted at first, then opened with a sharp metallic snap. Inside lay a collection of documents carefully wrapped in oilcloth, letters, receipts, photographs, and a faded black and white image showing Samuel Whitcomb standing beside a field of unusually tall corn. On the back, someone had written Red Flint, 42 trial plot, summer 1976. Clara's pulse quickened. She continued searching. At the bottom of the box rested a yellowed envelope bearing the letterhead of an organization she had never heard of. Midwestern Seed Preservation Cooperative. The date read 1978. She unfolded the letter carefully. Most of the ink remained legible. The contents left her speechless. The cooperative thanked Samuel for preserving a drought-resistant heritage corn line identified as RF-42. According to the letter, the variety descended from seed stock tested throughout the Great Plains after the Dust Bowl years. Researchers believed the strain contained unusually strong drought tolerance characteristics. Several universities had requested samples. Yet the letter also mentioned something unexpected. Funding cuts had ended the project before full research could be completed. Responsibility for preservation had been transferred back to participating farmers, including Samuel Whitcomb. Clara read the final paragraph twice, then a third time. For decades, the seed boxes had not simply stored old corn. They had stored a living archive, a responsibility, a promise. One Samuel had quietly continued long after everyone else forgot. An hour later, Ben arrived on his bicycle. His eyes widened as Clara spread documents across the kitchen table. "Where'd you find all this hidden in the barn?" The boy picked up one photograph. "Grandpa never told anyone. I don't think he wanted attention." That sounded exactly like Samuel. Outside, wind moved gently through the cottonwoods. Inside, Clara continued sorting papers. Near the bottom of the box, she discovered another surprise. A folded county map, different from the one hanging in the barn. This version contained handwritten markings in red pencil. The south ditch appeared again. So did several field boundaries. And beside one section, Samuel had written, "Water first. Seed second." Ben frowned. What does that mean? I don't know yet. But she intended to find out. Later that afternoon, Clara drove to visit Lila Calhoun. Lila examined the documents, while Clara explained everything. When she finished, Lila sat back quietly. Samuel never talked about this, not once. Lila shook her head. Maybe he thought nobody would care. The comment lingered, because it felt true. Over the years, the farming world had changed. New hybrids arrived. Technology improved. Corporate agriculture expanded. Perhaps Samuel believed nobody wanted to hear about old seed lines anymore. Yet one person might. Dr. Leah Mercer. Before sunset, Clara photographed every document and emailed copies to the extension office. She attached a short note. Please look at these before the auction. Less than 2 hours later, her phone rang. Leah's voice sounded very different from their previous conversation. No skepticism, no caution, only urgency. Clara, she said, I've only reviewed part of what you sent. And a pause followed, the kind that makes a person's heart beat faster. Don't let anyone throw those seed boxes away. Clara gripped the phone tighter. What? Another pause. Longer this time. Because I think your father may have been preserving something far more important than anyone realized. The line went quiet, and for the first time since the foreclosure notice arrived, Clara felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. But the auction was only 2 days away, and hope alone wasn't enough to stop it. Hope arrived at Harper Bend Farm like a distant rain cloud. Visible, promising, but still far away. The morning after Dr. Leah Mercer's phone call, Clara Whitcomb drove back to the extension office carrying every document she had found in the metal box. Leah was already waiting. Several folders lay open across a conference table. Research papers, county agricultural records, archived reports. The evidence was growing, but not fast enough. Leah pointed toward one of the documents. The cooperative records are real. Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And R. F. 42. Leah leaned back. I found references to it. References, not complete research. The answer frustrated both of them. The original testing program ended before the data was fully published. So nobody knows what it is. Leah shook her head. Nobody knows exactly. The room fell quiet. Outside, traffic moved along Main Street. Inside, time seemed to accelerate. The auction was less than 24 hours away. We need proof, Clara said. We need laboratory verification. Leah nodded. I've already contacted a regional genetics lab. And the expedited testing isn't cheap. Of course it wasn't. Nothing important ever seemed to be. Clara looked down at her hands. She already knew there was almost no money left. Every available dollar had gone toward loan payments, repairs, and operating expenses. Leah hesitated. There may be one way. What? If we can fund emergency testing today, preliminary results could arrive before the auction begins. The possibility hung in the air, close enough to touch, yet financially impossible. By lunchtime, Clara was back at Harper Bend. She spent nearly an hour sitting inside the machinery shed, not working, not moving, just thinking. Around her stood decades of family history. Tools, equipment, memories. Then her eyes settled on the old Farmel tractor, Samuel's tractor. Bright red once, now faded and weathered. The machine hadn't worked regularly in years, but Samuel loved it. He used to say that every farm should keep at least one machine older than its owner. Old equipment teaches patience. That was one of his favorite sayings. Clara smiled sadly. Then the smile disappeared, because she knew exactly what she had to do. By afternoon, she was standing in the yard beside a livestock dealer from the neighboring county. The man walked slowly around the farmall, checking tires, examining the engine, assessing value. "She's rough," he said. "I know. But collectible." Clara nodded. The dealer named a price, lower than Samuel would have liked, higher than she expected. Either way, it felt wrong. Selling the tractor felt like selling a conversation she could never have again. Yet she signed the paperwork, because preserving her father's real legacy mattered more than preserving a machine. When the truck finally pulled away carrying the farmall, Clara stood alone beside the driveway, watching until it disappeared beyond the trees. A part of Harper Bend Farm left with it. That evening, she wired the testing fee, every available dollar, almost the last money she had. At sunset, attorney Ruth Hensley arrived. Ruth practiced law in Mason Creek and had known the Whitcomb family for years. After reviewing the documents, she removed her glasses and sighed. This is promising. Promising. Not certain. Promising. Clara was beginning to hate that word. If the lab confirms significance, Ruth continued, we may have grounds to challenge how the auction is structured. May. The bank listed the farm as agricultural property. Ruth tapped the seed records. If these materials represent protected genetic resources or intellectual agricultural assets, the situation becomes more complicated. Complicated sounded better than hopeless, but not by much. Night settled over Harper Bend. Lights glowed in the farmhouse kitchen. The barn stood quiet beyond the yard, and somewhere between midnight and dawn, Clara's phone remained silent. No lab results. No miracle. Only waiting. The next morning, auction crews began arriving. Temporary signs appeared along the road. Buyers started checking into local motels. Nolan Vance was already in town. Everything was moving forward, whether Clara was ready or not. Just after sunrise, her phone vibrated. A message from Leah. Only 6 words. Results pending. Running final verification. Clara stared at the screen. The auction would begin in less than 3 hours. And the answer that might save Harper Bend Farm was still trapped somewhere inside a laboratory hundreds of miles away. By 9 o'clock that morning, Harper Bend Farm no longer felt like a farm. It felt like a public event. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the gravel road. Buyers wandered across the property carrying coffee cups and auction catalogs. Conversations drifted through the spring air, while groups gathered near equipment, outbuildings, and fence lines. Some people came hoping to buy. Others came simply to watch. In rural counties, farm auctions carried a strange kind of gravity. They weren't just business transactions. They were the final chapter of someone's story. Clara Whitcomb stood near the barn watching the crowd grow. She had slept less than 2 hours. The lab results still hadn't arrived. Neither had Dr. Leah Mercer. Every passing minute tightened the knot in her stomach. Across the yard, Nolan Vance spoke with several investors while reviewing property maps. He looked calm and prepared. Daniel Rusk stood nearby representing First Prairie Bank. His expression remained professional, though Clara noticed he seemed uncomfortable with the growing crowd. At precisely 10 o'clock, auctioneer Earl Maddox climbed onto a flatbed trailer and picked up a microphone. Earl had spent 30 years selling farms, cattle, machinery, and land. His voice carried across the property with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming." The crowd settled. "We have an excellent opportunity here today." Clara closed her eyes briefly. Excellent opportunity. Not family history. Not generations of work. Opportunity. Earl began describing the acreage, the fields, the buildings, the water access, the development potential. Several buyers nodded. Nolan listened carefully. Everything moved exactly as planned, exactly as Clara feared. Then Earl turned toward the barn. "And over here," he announced, gesturing with one hand. "We've got an old storage barn." A few people followed him inside. Clara remained close behind. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the weathered walls. Dust floated in the air. The seed boxes sat where they always had. Silent. Forgotten. Or so everyone believed. Earl swept his arm dramatically. "Not much left in here." A few people laughed. Some shelves. Some tools. Some old seed boxes nobody's been interested in for years. More laughter followed. Not cruel. Not malicious. Just casual dismissal. The kind Clara had been hearing for months, maybe years. A buyer near the back kicked lightly at one of the wooden boxes. "Doubt those are worth hauling home." Several people chuckled. Clara's jaw tightened. She stepped forward. "Those boxes aren't junk." Earl smiled politely. "I'm sure they mean something to you." Clara. The words sounded reasonable, yet somehow made everything worse, because nobody else believed they meant anything. Nolan approached slowly. "I'll admit they're interesting." Clara looked at him sharply. "Interesting. Historical." He shrugged. "People pay good money for agricultural antiques." The statement drew a few approving nods. Decoration. That was what decades of Samuel Whitcomb's work had become. Decoration. A buyer reached down and lifted one of the boxes. The wood slipped unexpectedly. The lid shifted. Several packets spilled onto the floor. Red kernels scattered across the dirt. The crowd barely noticed. Until a voice spoke from near the doorway. "Wait." The room fell quiet. An older man wearing a gray sport coat stepped forward. One of the agricultural consultants Nolan had brought to evaluate the property. He crouched beside the spilled seed packets, carefully picked one up, and stared. His expression changed almost immediately. Gone was the casual curiosity. Gone was the amusement. Instead, confusion appeared, then disbelief. Slowly, he turned one of the boxes toward the light. A faded marking became visible. RF 42. The consultant froze. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Even Earl stopped talking. The consultant traced the letters with his thumb, then looked toward Clara. "Where did these come from?" Before she could answer, a vehicle raced up the gravel driveway outside. Tires scattered dust across the yard. Heads turned toward the open barn doors. A county extension truck. The driver's door flew open. "Doctor." Leah Mercer stepped out carrying a thick envelope in one hand, and judging by the urgency on her face, she hadn't driven all the way to Harper Bend Farm just to watch an auction. For a moment, nobody moved. The barn that had been full of conversation only seconds earlier now stood completely silent. Dust drifted through shafts of sunlight. The spilled red kernels remained scattered across the floor, and every eye followed Dr. Leah Mercer as she walked through the doorway carrying the thick envelope. Auctioneer Earl Maddox lowered his microphone. "What exactly is going on?" he asked. Leah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed the barn and stopped beside the seed boxes. The agricultural consultant who had recognized the RF-42 marking stepped forward. I thought those codes looked familiar. Leah nodded. So did I. She placed the envelope on a nearby workbench and carefully removed several documents. Laboratory reports, historical records, verification certificates. The crowd watched in complete silence. Even Nolan Vance appeared uncertain now. Daniel Rusk folded his arms and listened. Leah took a slow breath. Before this auction continues, there is information everyone needs to hear. The barn remained still. No one interrupted. 3 days ago, Harper Bend Farm submitted seed samples for emergency analysis. She lifted one report. The preliminary results have now been verified. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. Leah looked directly at the crowd. The seed line identified as RF-42 is authentic. A murmur spread through the room. Leah continued. It belongs to a heritage drought-resistant corn strain preserved through regional agricultural trials that began after the Dust Bowl era. Several people exchanged confused looks. Others leaned closer. The consultant beside the boxes slowly nodded, as if confirming something he already suspected. Leah opened another folder. The strain was believed lost decades ago. This time the reaction was stronger. Not laughter, not skepticism. Surprise. Genuine surprise. She held up Samuel Whitcomb's notebook. For over 40 years, Samuel Whitcomb maintained field records documenting the performance, survival rates, and environmental response of this seed line. She turned several pages. The data is extraordinary. Clara stared at the notebook. The same notebook Daniel had barely glanced at inside the bank office. The same notebook people had dismissed as old memories. Now everyone wanted to see it. Nolan stepped forward. Are you saying the seeds have commercial value? Leah chose her words carefully. I'm saying they possess documented genetic significance, historical significance, and potentially substantial agricultural value. Potentially. The scientist in her refused to exaggerate, but she didn't need to. The effect was already visible. Faces had changed. Expressions had changed. The room itself had changed. Leah then removed another document. This is where things become more complicated. Attorney Ruth Hensley moved closer. Leah continued. The preservation records indicate that RF-42 was maintained under a conservation agreement through the Midwestern Seed Preservation Cooperative. Ruth nodded slowly. I thought so. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Ruth answered before Leah could. It means these assets may not legally be part of the auction inventory as currently listed. The crowd erupted into whispers. Daniel's eyes widened. What? Ruth opened her briefcase. The bank's foreclosure documents describe agricultural land, buildings, and equipment. She pointed toward the seed boxes. If these materials constitute documented conservation assets, they require separate valuation and legal review. Earl lowered his microphone completely. Nobody cared about bidding anymore. The auction had become something else, something larger. Something nobody expected. Nolan studied the documents carefully. For the first time all day, he looked less like a buyer and more like a student. The consultant beside him finally spoke. You realize what this means? Leah nodded. I do. The man looked around the barn, then toward Clara. Your father wasn't storing old seed. He paused. Every person in the room listened. He was preserving a living genetic archive. Silence followed. A deeper silence than before. Not embarrassment. Respect. The kind that arrives when people suddenly realize they have misunderstood something important. Clara looked around the barn, at Roy Bell, at Daniel Rusk, at Nolan Vance, at neighbors who had laughed. Nobody was laughing now. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, decades of Samuel Whitcomb's quiet work finally stood in the open. But Ruth Hensley wasn't finished. She opened another folder. There is one more issue. Everyone turned toward her. Ruth adjusted her glasses. If these conservation assets are legally separate from the foreclosure inventory, then today's auction may have been structured incorrectly from the beginning. The room fell silent again. Because for the first time all day, the future of Harper Bend Farm was no longer certain. And neither was the auction. The silence inside the barn lasted longer than anyone expected. Auctioneer Earl Maddox stood with his microphone lowered. The buyers who had arrived ready to bid on land now found themselves listening to attorneys, agricultural researchers, and conservation records. The auction was no longer moving forward, at least not today. Daniel Rusk requested a private review of the documents. For nearly an hour, representatives from First Prairie Bank, Ruth Hensley, Dr. Leah Mercer, and several county officials examined the records Samuel Whitcomb had left behind. The crowd waited outside. Some leaned against pickup trucks. Others gathered beneath the cottonwoods near the barn. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Everyone wanted to know how the story ended. When Daniel finally emerged, he looked exhausted, but he also looked different. Less like a banker protecting numbers, more like a man trying to correct a mistake. "The auction is suspended," he announced. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Daniel continued, "Pending a full legal and agricultural valuation review." For a moment, Clara couldn't move. The words felt unreal. Not victory, but breathing room. The first real breathing room she had received in months. Several weeks later, the review produced results nobody had anticipated. The conservation records proved legitimate. The seed collection held documented historical and agricultural value. Not enough to make Clara wealthy. Not enough to erase every financial problem, but enough to fundamentally change the situation. The bank agreed to restructure part of the debt. The County Agricultural Extension Office partnered with a regional university to preserve and study the RF42 seed line. And perhaps most importantly, the seed collection itself could no longer be treated as forgotten property, buried inside an old barn. It had become recognized, protected, valued. Yet the outcome still required sacrifice. The debt had not magically disappeared. Clara sold the southern section of Harper Bend Farm, the least productive acreage near the highway. The decision hurt. Every acre carried memories. Every fence line held history. But keeping everything had never been realistic. The sale provided enough money to stabilize the remaining operation. For the first time in years, Clara could see a future beyond the next payment notice. Nolan Vance surprised everyone, including Clara. Instead of fighting the new valuation, he approached her with a different proposal. He offered to help fund a regional heritage seed demonstration program connected to his agricultural project. Not because he suddenly became sentimental, because he recognized value when he saw it. The two never became close friends, but they learned something important about one another. Sometimes progress and tradition weren't enemies. Sometimes they simply needed to speak the same language. One afternoon in early summer, Roy Bell stopped by Harper Bend. He removed his cap before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Clara smiled slightly. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not." Roy looked toward the barn, but I laughed. Clara followed his gaze. "So did a lot of people." Roy nodded, then quietly added, "Won't make that mistake again." Months later, new shelves lined the north wall of the barn. The seed boxes sat carefully organized beneath climate-controlled storage units provided through the preservation program. Yet one thing was missing: the old farmall tractor. Sometimes Clara still noticed the empty space where it once stood, and every time she did, she felt a small ache. Saving Harper Bend Farm had cost something. It always would. One evening, as the sun settled behind the fields, Ben helped plant a small demonstration plot using seeds descended from RF-42. They worked quietly, the way Samuel Whitcomb would have preferred. When they finished, Ben looked across the rows. Think Grandpa knew all this would happen. Clara smiled. The wind moved gently through the grass. Far beyond the fields, the south ditch still guided water exactly where Samuel intended decades earlier. "I don't think he expected people to remember him," she said. Ben looked surprised. "Then why save everything?" Clara glanced toward the barn, toward the notebooks, the maps, the boxes, the work of a lifetime. Because he hoped somebody would remember the land. The evening light faded slowly across Harper Bend Farm. The debt wasn't completely gone. The future wasn't guaranteed. The farm was smaller now, but it was still there. And sometimes, that was enough. There are people in every town, every county, and every generation who spend their lives protecting something others barely notice. Sometimes it's a family farm. Sometimes it's an old workshop. Sometimes it's a tradition, a notebook, a forgotten road, or a box tucked away in the corner of a barn. Most of the time, those people never ask for recognition. They simply keep showing up, day after day, year after year, and often, the world mistakes their quiet dedication for stubbornness. Samuel Whitcomb never became famous. He never appeared in newspapers. He never stood in front of crowds explaining why his work mattered. Yet because he cared enough to preserve something small, that small thing survived long enough to matter again. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Not because of the auction, not because of the conflict, but because all of us have known someone who quietly carried responsibility without applause. Someone who kept going when nobody was watching. If this story reminded you of a person like that, we'd love to hear about them. Tell us their story in the comments. And if you haven't already, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel and how many communities still understand the value of hard work, family, and perseverance. If you enjoyed spending time in Mason Creek and at Harper Bend Farm, please consider leaving a like, sharing your thoughts, and subscribing for more stories about rural America, forgotten wisdom, and ordinary people who prove that some things are worth saving. Until next time, take care of the people you love, remember the stories that built your community, and never be too quick to dismiss something simply because it looks old.